Okay, we're starting Siman Shin Chav Tes, which is about the different types of bread-like things that may or may not be chayiv in Hafrashas Challah. And today we're going to talk about Belilah Raccah and Belilah Avah. There's another part of it that we will either do next week or completely skip. A second half, which is very actually important to us. Okay, and the question, and we'll, just before I get started, just want to play like this. When we make cookies or bread or pizza or things like that, we make it with a thick dough, what we call Belilah Avah, which is thick. It's a clump of big, pops on the table. And when we think of Hafrashas Challah, that's what we think of. You do Hafrashas Challah when you make bread or cake or something, or bread or pizza or something like that. But there's also a different kind of mixtures of flour and water, which is made from flour and water, but there's so much less flour that it's a very liquidy batter. Okay, think of like what you make sponge cake out of. Okay, so that batter just pours out. Most people don't associate that with Hafrashas Challah, and the reason why you don't think of it for Hafrashas Challah is because at home that batter has so little flour in it that it's really hard to get a sheer challah in such a batter. So even though we're going to see in a second that the din is that is chayiv in challah, there is a chiv of Hafrashas Challah under the right circumstances. But most people don't even associate it with Hafrashas Challah for it because in a home you never saw your mother being mafresh challah for that. It's like doesn't exist in the house. Not very common, but there is such a thing. And in the second part, which we're not going to do today, we'll talk about how you measure that and how you get the sheer challah. It has its own complication to that thing. And how you do the Hafrashas Challah for Belilah Raccah. That's also for that. But today is talk about Belilah Raccah, and we're actually going to digress to a lot about Belilah Avah also, which is very intertwined with this thing. Okay? So, okay, and one more introduction to tell you is that something that we've seen beforehand, which is when the Torah talks about being mafresh challah, it says v'hoya ba'chocha milechem haaretz, when you eat from the lechem. Okay, we learned that, and we talked before, and we learned that a lot of halachas on that is lechem. Okay, and the reason why we're learning something from it is because it's really odd that it says lechem, because you're not chayiv in challah when you make it into bread. You're really chayiv in challah when you mix the flour and water together. That's when that's when the chiyuv challah comes. So the fact that the Torah calls, Rash Rabbeinu Tam, but the fact that it says lechem, we learn a whole piles of things out of that, including, for our purposes for today, is that it needs to hold on to the lechem form. It has to be appropriate to chayiv in challah, even when it's in the lechem form, not only when it's in the dough form. Okay, it has to hold that form. It has to somehow be chayiv Hafrashas Challah even at the lechem stage. Okay. So now let's go like this. Okay. In Mishnah's Challah, the fourth Mishnah says that a number of things are potter from Hafrashas Challah. It gives you a whole slew of cases. And among those cases are three cases: Sufkinin, Haduvshin, V'Haskavita. These three things, we will call them Sufkinin just for easiness, and because we're going to talk about them more in a second. That's in Halacha Aleph here in Siman Shin Chav Tes, that Sufkinin are Patim L'Challah. Okay, Sufkinin means this, like I explained to you, think of the word svoig, like sponge, okay, or think of the modern word, which is really not appropriate for this, is sufganiyot, okay? No, yeah. It's really not. That's a takeoff on the word because of the consistency. It's actually not the case, because it's a Belilah Raccah. Sufganiyot are not made from Belilah Raccah, made from Belilah Avah. But sufganin, like as in sponge cake, is a spongy kind of a thing, and it has it's a very watery batter that you make it out of, okay? So the Mishnah says it's popping from challah. No chayiv challah, and challah alaf here in the sim. Okay, there's a machlokes in the Gemara in Psachim, machlokes Rash and Rabbeinu Tam. What case is it that the Mishnah said is potter? Okay, Rash says it's potter in a very, very specific case. Okay, the case is, I have to look at my paper here. The case is you had a frying pan. I mean, not in the oven. It was on the top of the stove top. It was in a frying pan. You poured the batter into it, and then you cooked it after you heated it up. After you put the liquid into it. Okay, so the cooking of it, the baking of it, is very not lechem-like. Okay, when you bake bread, you heat up the oven first, and then you put it in. And over here, you do it on a stovetop, and you put the pan on. You put it into the pan, and then you heat it up. All of that is very not bread-like, and therefore, what? No, in a bleach you heat it first. Rash says you only pop it if you put it into the thing, and then you heat it up. You fill up the pot, and then you stick it onto the thing. Okay, so that's what Rash says. Every other case Rash says is already enough lechem like that you're chayiv. Okay, and Rabbi says no, you're chayiv in challah in that case, and when you put it. Rabbi says You're potter no matter what you did. The only case that you're chayiv is, the only case that you'd be chayiv is if you baked it in the sun. That's going to be a din coming later on if you baked it in the sun. Okay, but all the cases, whether you did it on the top of the frying pan or in the oven and you heat it up, all those kind of cases, all those cases are included in the Mishnah where it says that he potter. And there's only one case. I'm sorry. Back up. Rabbi Yochanan says all those cases are potter from Hafrashas Challah. Okay, all those cases are potter from Hafrashas Challah, and there's only one case that you chayiv on Hafrashas Challah. There are very few cases when you can be chayiv on Hafrashas Challah. Okay, so and that's halacha beis. Okay, these details it's swimming in my head, but they're not so important for what we're going to talk about today. Halacha beis says isa Belilah Raccah. If you have a Belilah Raccah batter for a tanner, you baked it in the oven. Oi, the machlas. Or you baked it in a frying pan on top of the oven. And in the machwas is ben shir siach v'achikach hidbik. Whether you heated up the pan and then put it in like a pancake. Ben shir hidbik v'achikach siach, or you put the stuff in and then you heated it up. Chayev b'challah. All those cases are chayev in challah. Rabbi Yochanan says they're chayev in challah, right? Ubovad shlei de mashke. Rabbi Yochanan agrees. This comes from Yerushalmi. Rabbi Yochanan says that if you cooked it, if you took the Belilah Raccah and you cooked it in water or in oil, then you'd be patur from challah. Okay, so that's the second din over here. But what we've gotten out of the fourth Mishnah, whether Rabbi Yochanan Mishakos is not so relevant to us, the Mishnah said, Mishnah Dalet said, Sufkanin apatim from Challah. Okay. Why does the Mishnah say Sufkanin apatim from Challah? Why did it pick a case of Belilah Raccah and say that Belilah Raccah is patur from Challah? Again, depending on how you baked it at the end. Why did it pick Belilah Raccah case? That tells us that's a hint to us that this kula, that this thing is patur from Challah, has to do with being Belilah Raccah. Had this been Belilah Avah, and you did the same kind of a finishing of the process, it would be chayiv in Challah. Okay, it's there's something more kal about Belilah Raccah. Belilah Raccah is chayiv in Hafrashas Challah, but not as much as Belilah Avah. There's a kula to it. There are some cases that Belilah Raccah is patur, but Belilah Avah is going to be chayiv. Okay, the Mishnah doesn't tell us what those cases are. Okay, well, what's the case of Belilah Avah is chayiv? So the Machlokes is showing you what's the case that they're different. That Belilah Raccah is patur, but Belilah Avah is chayiv. Okay, Machlokes, you may have heard the names of Rabbeinu Tam and the Rash. Okay, I'll use the name Rash. There's many Rishonim holding that the Ramban and the Rash. We'll use the Rash as the one who says that. Okay, Rabbeinu Tam and the Rash have this Machlokes. Okay, and the Machlokes starts as follows. If you look, he says, Rabbeinu Tam says, look at the very next Mishnah, and you'll find out what's the difference between Belilah Raccah and Belilah Avah. And the difference is like this. Again, Mishnah Dalet said, Sufkin and Pater. Mishnah Hay says like this. I'm not reading you all the cases. Tchilasa Isa, the Seifa Sufkin. What happens if you made a dough that was Tchilasa Isa? That is to say, you didn't make it Sufkin, you didn't make it in the Belilah Raccah, you made it in the Belilah Avah. Okay? So you made something like donuts. Okay? You took a thicker dough, you made the Seifa Sufkin. And in the end, you processed it like Sufkin. Means you cooked it in the way that you cook a Belilah Raccah, but you started off with a Belilah Avah. So what's the din? And a few other cases, chayeves. That case is chayev. So the Mishnah Dalet said, Sufkin, when you start with a Belilah Raccah, you're patur. And Mishnah Hay said, if you started with a Belilah Avah, I don't care if you finish it like a Belilah Raccah, you're chayev anyhow.
You water it down, right?
You cooked it in the way you cooked it. The cooking of it was done like Belilah Raccah would have been cooked. So Rabbeinu Tam says, you see from here, that if you started, no matter the way Rabbeinu Tam is repeated is, if you started with a Belilah Avah, you're always going to be chayiv, no matter what you did with it afterwards. No matter what you decided to do with this thing afterwards, it's going to be chayiv. And if you started with a Belilah Raccah, then it depends how you finished it off. Rabbi Yochanan talked about how you finished it off, whether it should be chayiv or it should be patur. That's what Rabbeinu Tam says. The Rash.
That means even if you would change around, let's say, I know there's cases of morpus, I forgot the word, where you make it like for shepherd food or dog food.
We'll come to it. No matter what you did with it at the end, the way Rabbeinu Tam is brought as saying, you're going to be chayiv no matter what. Okay, the Rash says, he says, I don't know what to tell you. He says, I don't know what the Gemara says. This is a Gemara in Brachos. The Gemara says, one of the cases that Rabbi Aslan was trying to mention was, lechem ha'asher l'kutach. Okay, if you make bread, but when you make the bread, your plan is not to eat that bread regular, but to make it into kutach. What's kutach? It's some kind of like a dressing or a dip that people would use for their food, and it had bread in it, chunks of bread in it, whatever that meant. So that lechem, that kutach, it's a what?
Moldy bread.
Moldy bread. Yeah, it's a Pesach did also, just coming out of Pesach. Okay, it's
sour.
so this kutach, if you lechem oshel kutach, the Gemara says that there are certain cases when it's part from Hafrashas Challah. Okay, what those cases are not negated. We'll come to that in a few times from now. It's halacha zayin over here. Lechem oshel kutach. It's going to be later on what cases it is chayiv or it's not chayiv. But there are cases that it's potter. So the Rash says, well, lechem oshel kutach means is you made a Belilah Avah, but you made bread. But your intention was to turn it into, you're going to make it into kutach in the end. So you see from there that if you started with a Belilah Avah, there are sometimes that just because you started with a Belilah Avah, that doesn't make you potter. You could be chayiv anyhow, even though it started Belilah Avah. So Rabbeinu Tam said, no, you see from Mishnah Hey that no matter what, Tchilas Isa is always chayiv. He says, no, it's not true. Okay? So what's the answer? So, but when I said the Mishnah did say that Tchilas Isa is chayiv, so the Rash is like this. If you make a Belilah Avah without any special intentions, you're chayiv. If you had in mind when you were making the Belilah Avah, you said, I'm making lechem ha'osui l'kutach. Okay, you made it with the intention that this will become kutach in the end, then that dough is not chayiv l'challah. Which is to say, the person already had in mind at the beginning, so even in the dough stage, when it was being made into dough, it was already not, it wasn't anything special, and therefore it's not chayiv l'challah. Okay, so he says that Meduik in the mission in the Gemara they said lechem or oshel kutach, not lechem that's in kutach, a lesson that had that intention to be like that. Okay, and that's what it says in Mishnah Halacha Gimel. That's what in Halacha Gimel yes. It says Isa Belilah Avah. There's a typo here. All the places can there's a typo. Isa Belilah Avah. Okay, the Gilgala of Das Lafashla, when you kneaded the dough, you had in mind you're going to cook this. Oil Latagna, you're going to fry it. Oil Asesa Sufkinin, or you're going to make it into Sufkinin. Oil Liapsha Bacham, or you're going to dry it out in the sun. For Asakan, and you actually follow through on your plan, Petura, it's potter. That means that even though the Mahalacha Bey said, and the Mishnah Hay said, Tchilasa Isa V'Soifa Sufkinin is Chayev, but Halacha Gimel says, no. That's only if it turned out like that. But if you had that in mind from the beginning, if your plan was originally you're going to make it a Belilah Avah, and you are going to be making Kesufkin, that was your plan from the beginning, or you're going to make Kutach, or all these other kind of other things, and you actually follow through on your plan, then you're chayiv. Then you're a potter. Okay, now I'm not reading the rest of the din, and the next din there are exceptions. There are cases when you're not chayiv, but by and large, the Mechaber passes like the Rash that if you had in mind from the beginning that you're going to make this Belilah Avah into something like Sufkinin, then you're potter. Then you're potter. Okay, now, I'll just tell you for your knowledge, if we do this for next time, which is, the Shach doesn't agree with that. The Shach says we should be machmir for a bit of time. For the next time, if we get to there, we're going to talk about what that means. And there's some halach l'maisa parts to what that means to be machmir for a bit of time, about Belilah Avah, this kind of special case. Exactly what that means. Okay, but for now, we have this machlokes, the Rash, the Rabbeinu Tam and the Rash, the Mechaber passing like the Rash. Okay, but that's fine. Okay, but we have a question here. Okay, the Rash asked a really good question. He said, Rabbeinu Tam said, if you make Belilah Avah, it's always going to be chayiv. Really? The Gemara says that lechem oshel l'kutach is potter. So it was a good question. What's Rabbeinu Tam going to do with that question? Okay, I was surprised, but I don't see the Beis are talking about it. But I do see that the Dr. Moshe says, he says, if you go look in Rabbeinu Yonah, Rabbeinu Yonah means in the back of Gemara Brachos, go look at Rabbeinu Yonah and you'll see that even Rabbeinu Tam agrees that if you make lechem, you make a Belilah Avah to make pasta out of it, okay, Isas Lakshin, okay, you make an Isa in order to make Lakshin out of it, so that's a Belilah Avah, that's how you make pasta, you make it with a Belilah Avah, but the intention is at the end to turn it into something that will not be bread. That's not going to be bread because it doesn't have Teresa Dinahama, it doesn't have the Toya Lechem, it doesn't look like bread. If you do that, Rabbeinu Tam agrees that you're potter from Hafrashas Challah. That's what he says. Go look at Rabbeinu Yonah and you'll see that's what he says. Now, if you look at the Pesach, hold on a second. If you look at Pesach Jubi says, I don't know what he's talking about. I don't see anything in Rabbeinu Yonah. Okay, so we're going to explain to you what that means. He says, go look at Rabbeinu Yonah, you're going to see that he says that if he makes Isas Lakshin, Rabbeinu Tam is moida that you're chayiv Challah. That you're potter from Challah. Okay, so again, we have back our question, the same question Rabbeinu Tam. The Gemara said Isas Kutach is potter. And now, you just told me now Rabbeinu Yonah says that if you left them Isas Lakshin is also potter. What happened? Rabbeinu Tam says that that if you make a Belilah Avah, you're always chayiv. Well, now we just came across two cases that we're saying that Rabbeinu Tam is moida, that you have a Belilah Avah that you're not chayiv. So make up your mind. Is it automatic that you're chayiv or you're not? Which one is it? Okay, is it automatic? Does Rabbeinu Tam really hold that no matter what, a Belilah Avah is automatically chayiv, which is how he's always quoted as saying. And we'll see many people hold like that.
Would there be a machlokes in the Rash, or there would be a machlokes?
We'll come. So that's what we're coming to. We're trying to understand what Rabbeinu Tam really said. Okay, what did he really say to know if and how much of a machlokes is? Okay, so what Rabbanu Tam said that if you had in mind to make it, you were going to cook the dough, or you had in mind that you're going to bake it in the sun, those are things that are not lechem like. Both cases are chayiv. And somehow, if you're going to turn it into pasta, you should be part of what's going on here. Okay? So the answer to this question comes from this Rabbeinu Yonah. Okay? That's what the Darkei Moshe was telling you. Look at the Rabbeinu Yonah, is because the Rabbeinu Yonah only gives you the answer, the explanation for which you'll figure out the Isis Lakshan also. Okay? What I'm going to tell you, the way I'm going to explain it to you now, is what it says in Rabbeinu Yonah, with help from the Kashrus. Okay? Kashrus is masbered in a way. I don't know if we would get it all straight by ourselves just looking at the Rabbeinu Yonah. And I'm telling you, the Pesach Tshuva brings it. I don't want to say what it says there in the Rabbeinu Yonah. So the Kashrus helps make sense of it. And he says like the Rabbeinu Yonah says like this. He says, that's the fourth Mishnah I told you, and the fifth Mishnah in Challah. Okay, in the eighth Mishnah it says, what Rabbi Yassin said, it says, Isis HaKlavim, if you make dough in order to make dog food. Okay, every other halacha wise, it all works from Hilchas Challah wise. It was everything else that you need to do for Hafrashas Challah work, except that you intended it for dog food instead of for humans. So the Mishnah says, give or take, the Mishnah says that you potter. Okay, it's the very last halacha in Hilchas Challah. It's in Shimon. At the end of Shimon Lamed, it says this: Isis HaKlavim is potter from Challah. Okay, that means you did everything right. It's the very last halacha. I mean, it's not the last Mishnah. So you did everything right to do it for Hafrashas Challah, but instead of for people you were making dog food, you potter from Hafrashas Challah. So, Rabbeinu Yonah says, what's Rabbeinu Tam going to say with that Mishnah? We're now up to a Mishnah. We're not just a quote of Isis Lakshin or Gemara Lechem Asu L'Kutach. Now we have a Mishnah that says Isis HaKlavim is part of Hafrashas Challah. Why is it part of Hafrashas Challah? The person made it was a Belilah Avah. So he says like this. He says when Rabbeinu Tam said that Belilah Avah is automatically chayiv in Hafrashas Challah. That's what Rabbeinu Tam said. No matter what, it's chayiv in Hafrashas Challah. He didn't mean it as seriously as you all think he meant. He didn't really mean it in what you think. What he meant was like this. The Torah says, Rash and Rabbeinu Tam. From the time you make dough is when you come chayiv in Challah. If at that time you were making what's called lechem, if you're making something that's lechem, you're chayiv in Hafrashas Challah. Doesn't make a difference if later on you make something else out of it. Doesn't even make a difference if later on you plan on doing something else to it afterwards. It's still chayiv challah because you're already chayiv at that point. But what happens if when you were making it, you weren't making a rishas echem? Okay, even the dough part of it that you were making wasn't anything. Like for example, if Isis HaKlavim, if the person was making something, you weren't making food. You were making dog food. You were making food for what people are going to eat. Okay. Then it may have been a Belilah Avah, but the point when Rabbeinu Tam says you're making a Belilah Avah, he meant is something with the advantages of a Belilah Avah. Belilah Avah, the advantage of Belilah Avah is that it already you see, so to speak, the lechem in this thing. This already has the character of lechem already. So if you make a Belilah Avah, but it has none of those characteristics, like you make it Isis HaKlavim, not chayiv in Challah. Even Rabbeinu Tam will agree they're not chayiv in Challah. So technically it's a Belilah Avah, but it has none of the milas of a Belilah Avah. It's not chayiv in Hafrashas Challah.
So what are the milas it's lacking?
What it's lacking is that the person who was eating this thing wasn't making it for food. Right? He was making. Imagine if he was making wallpaper.
That's in terms of the type of dough you're making.
No, so even though so the Rash holds right. So it has nothing to do with the dough. The dough looks right, but when you made this dough, you weren't making dough. You were making what looks like dough, but it's not really dough. Okay, it's really meant for dog food. Okay?
He doesn't say that the shepherds can eat it or something. That
I told you, we didn't talk about the details. That's the end of Shin Lamed. There are certain cases that you chayiv, but that one knows which cases you chayiv. The point is that there are cases that you potter. If there are any cases that you potter, it tells us, then not like Rabbeinu Tam. So Rabbeinu says, Rabbeinu Tam didn't really mean it. Okay? He didn't mean it the way everybody thinks that he says it. And the same thing is, when a person makes Isas Lakshin. Okay, he makes dough in order to make pasta. So again, the person who was making it was making something, in the mixing of the flour and water was to make something that's not going to be bread. Okay, he is making something that's going to have no Teresa de la Ham at the end. What? So here it's food, and here it's missing a different characteristic. Okay?
Well, you didn't say what the characteristics are under this.
It's whatever Binyan said. I'll tell you the one exception where Rabbeinu Tam argues on the Rash, then you'll hear a little bit what he's saying. A little bit. Raccah. Also, if the person makes lechem asu l'kutach, if you make lechem asu l'kutach, the same kind of thing, the person is again making something that's not going to be used as bread is. Okay, so now we have three different things. Each one of them is different. Okay, Isas Lakshin is not going to be eaten by people. Isas Lakshin is going to be not eaten, not made something that has Teresa de la Ham. It's not going to be bread like when it's finished. And what was my last case? And lechem asu l'kutach is not going to be eaten. Usually, eat bread to fill you up, to be like the starch of the meal, like to help the staple of the meal. And here it's going to be not. It's in a dip. It's totally not the way bread is supposed to be used. Okay, so all those things, Rabbeinu Tam, he's saying Rabbeinu Tam agrees that you didn't make it a Belilah Avah.
Right.
You made physically, you made a Belilah Avah, but it doesn't have any of those matters. So as opposed to the one case where Rabbeinu Tam will say that it doesn't make a difference, and you're chayav because you made a Belilah Avah, is when the person made sufkanim. Okay, when he made a dough, when he made sufkanim. Okay, when he made a dough, that he plans to fry it or to cook it afterwards. And the difference is, for that case, we're now more leaning towards the Kashrus, who explains this end part, which is like this: when you make a donut, all the characteristics of the donut, the finished donut that you make, are all exactly the same as bread. Okay? It's used by people. It's even has a Teresa de la Ham. Everything about it is bread-like. The finished product that you have in mind to make is complete bread. There's nothing different about it than bread, with one little exception. You cooked it instead of baking it. Okay? It has this one little thing that you did wrong, so to speak, which is that the way you got it to that point. But the original intention was to make something that's going to be bread. Okay? Now, you're going to have a funny way to get from here to there, but what you're making now, in the end, is going to be a bread-like thing. Okay? A donut is sufkania has a Teresa de la Ham. It's eaten by people. It's eaten as a staple. It's eaten the same way. Done everything treated. I didn't mean people eat that for breakfast. I mean it's eaten, to fill you up. It's completely bread-like in all of its characteristics. So the person who made the dough at the beginning had intention to have bread finished. That's all Rabbeinu Tam meant to say. Rabbeinu Tam didn't mean to say is if you're going to make something that the end product is not bread. You're going to make something that's going to be salad dressing. That's not bread. You're not trying to make bread. So then even from the dough side of it, it was already puffed. Okay? So, what's going on
here right now to be mafresh? You have a chiyuv right now. I mean,
when you need the dough?
When I need, I have
yes.
a chiyuv right now.
Yes.
So if he's mafresh it now, let's say now, and then he's come out Belilah Mafreya. There was like a bracha about Challah.
No, so I didn't read you those, didn't. But what if the person changes his mind in the middle? Everyone agrees in those cases he's chayav. We're talking about the guy had in mind from beginning to end. I'm taking this thing to make donuts. Okay, the guy's planning on making donuts. Okay, so it comes out. So now the Chazon says, now you have to tell you something. Now that I told you, the Chazon, the big point that the Chazon is making is that fried dough, what we call sufganiyot, donuts, have Teresa de la Ham, which is true. That's not a chiddush, but he's pointing that out, that case that Rabbeinu Tam is actually arguing about, that case actually has Teresa de la Ham. He says, now that I told you that sufganim have Teresa de la Ham, or even think about sponge cake, with the Mishnah with sufganim, sponge cake also has Teresa de la Ham. He says, now look back at Mishnah Hay. He says, and all of a sudden you're going to find out that Rabbeinu Tam's whole raya didn't prove what people think Rabbeinu Tam says. It only proved what I'm telling you Rabbeinu Tam says, which is like this. This is what the Mishnah said. Which says, Isa, B'Seifer Sufkinin. You started with an Isa, and you finished with Sufkinin. He says, how come the Mishnah said you finished with Sufkinin? That's not the strongest thing, the thing that's furthest from bread. Why did it say that you started with Isa and you finished with Sufkinin? What about if you started with Isa and you finished with pasta? What happens if you started with Isa and you finished with kutach? What happens if you started with Isa and ended with Isa saklavim? What happens if you went to something more extreme? The Mishnah did not say that in that case you're chayav. All the Mishnah said was you're chayav if you went this far. You started with the Isa and you got as you stretched it that you made it v'soifoi sufkanin. It didn't say in the Mishnah v'soifoi kutach, because in that case you would have not been chayav. So Rabbeinu Tam brought a right from Mishnah Hay. He said, look, it says in Mishnah Hay that if you start with an Is, you're always chayiv. It actually doesn't say that in Mishnah Hay. Mishnah Hay doesn't say you're always chayiv. It says you're chayiv even if you went a little bit beyond bread. Fried dough is not the same as baked dough, so it's a little bit beyond that. It didn't say even if you went very far from bread, it went so far. So when Rabbeinu Tam brought his right from Mishnah Hay, that you see in Mishnah Hay that Tchilasa Isa v'Soifa something is still chayiv. It doesn't say v'Soifa, I don't care what you make out of this thing. It's no, v'Soifa a certain distance, if you stretch a certain amount past the bread, that's within reason. That wouldn't work for Belilah Raccah. If Belilah Raccah started off Sufkin v'Soifa Sufkin, it would not work. That's not enough. But for Belilah Avah, you start with Tchilasa Isa, v'Soifa Sufkin, that's as far, that's the chayiv, but v'Soifa Pastel would not be chayiv. Okay? So, it turns out, if you accept this explanation, Rabbeinu Yonah, together with the Chazon Ish, together, if you accept this explanation, like Rabbi Zman said before him, Rabbeinu Yonah, the Rash and Rabbeinu Tam are all of a sudden not so different from each other. Okay, they're arguing about one very specific case, but by and large, they're really agreeing with each other. That if you have in mind when you make the Isa, if you have the right or the wrong thing in mind, you're not going to be chayiv, even if it's a Belilah Avah. They both agree conceptually. Okay? That's not how most people know of Rabbeinu Tam. The sheet of Rabbeinu Tam is understood usually to mean is that Rabbeinu Tam says if you make a Belilah Avah, you're chayiv. I don't care what happens afterwards. That was the shach hachiv. When you mix the flour and water, then it was Belilah Avah. You're finished. You're chayiv. Okay? So the very significant over here. What did Rabbeinu Tam really mean to say? Again, I'm not telling you the Mechaber didn't pass it yet, but it is relevant to us to know what we hold on, whether he holds like that for next time. So I don't have much to tell you in this Machlokes Rishonim as far as what we did pass like now. The Mechaber passes like the Rash. Okay, so we're not going to see anything we don't think. As I don't see anything in the Shulchan Aruch as to what he holds is shot in Rabbeinu Tam. He doesn't pass in Rabbeinu Tam. Okay, but we'll look in Beis Yosef. He brings a Rash and Rabbeinu who say within Shittas Rabbeinu Tam, they say the words are Afil Rabbeinu Tam Dinis Chayva Isasa B'Challah. That is to say, Tchilasa Isa and sorry for something. We're talking about. He says if you're talking about pasta. Dinis Chayva Isasa B'Challah. Ein Rach Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le'Le Tchvisa D'Nehama. Rabbeinu Tam agrees that it's Chayiv in Challah. Pasta is Chayiv in Challah. But it doesn't make Hamoitzi because it's missing Tchvisa D'Nehama. In other words, the time of Hafrashas Chiyav Challah is when you mix the flour and water. The time when you make a bracha is when it's already finished and it's processed. So when you mix the flour and water, it was a Belilah Avah. When you ate it, it was not Tchvisa D'Nehama. So it's Chayiv and Challah, but it's patur from it. You don't make Hamoitzi on it. Okay? So what is he saying? He's saying Rabbeinu Tam agrees that Isa's Lakshin is Chayiv is Chayiv and Challah. Okay, not like Rabbeinu Yonah. Okay, the Beis Yosef is saying from the Russian places, not like Rabbeinu Yonah, that Rabbeinu Tam taka holds like what the classic way of thinking of Rabbeinu Tam, which is that you're chayiv. Okay, I told you that the Dr. Moshe quotes this Rabbeinu Yonah. He says, look at the Rabbeinu Yonah, you'll see that's what he says. But that's only the second half of the Dr. Moshe. Okay, the first half of the Dr. Moshe brings from a Mordechai. Okay, brings from a Mordechai who says that according to Rabbeinu Tam, Isa's Lakshin is Chayiv and Hafrashas Challah. Okay, that's he brings that sheet, and there's another place where Dr. Moshe also brings it in Brachas. Where he's also that the Mordechai says like the Beis Yosef said. So now in the Dr. Moshe is making a point of it. He says the Mordechai says that according to Rabbeinu Tam, Isa's Lakshin is Chayiv, but I'm telling you, Rabbeinu Yonah says that it's patur, as if that's his conclusion that's correct. That Rabbeinu Tam really holds that it's patur. So it can send that some machlokes here between the Mechaber and the Mechaber and the Ramah. Again, neither of them passing like the Rash Halacha, but what they did is what is the Rash really? I'm sorry, what the understanding of Rabbeinu Tam can send the machlokes the Mechaber and the Ramah. The Shach implies, like the classic way, it's hard to say for sure. The Shach says. Miu Habib Poskim Chokim, which say Rabbeinu Tam are many Poskim Chokim Rabbeinu Tam, not like the Mechaber. The Hecha the Belilah Avah, Afil Gilgal Adas Lavashla, Chayeves B'Challah. The Miyad Nischayv Mishas Gilgal K'Deisa Beis Yosef. Okay, that's like the classic way. It sounds very much like the classic way, which is as long as you made a Belilah Avah, I don't care what you do afterwards. You can be chayiv no matter what. Implying again like the simple way, and he has K'Deisa Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef is pretty clear that he means. like the classic way. There's a question. There's actually a Taz and a Magen Avraham about it, a little bit about it, in Aruch here in Hilchos Brachos. Okay, so anyhow, so we have. So if I could just summarize for a second, we have a machlokes whether we have some data about Belilah Raccah. We have this machlokes by Belilah Avah. If you started off with dough, is it automatically chayiv in Hafrashas Challah, Rash and Rabbeinu Tam, or is it only chayiv in Hafrashas Challah if you had in mind, if you didn't have in mind to do something wrong with it, so to speak, at the end? And then within the sheet of Rabbeinu Tam, the simple understanding was that he means it literally, that you're chayiv in Hafrashas Challah no matter what. If you start with the Belilah Avah, you're chayiv. Stand on your head, you're always going to be chayiv. But the Rabbeinu Yonah, which is back here, which it brings, is saying that maybe he didn't really mean it so much, and basically he's going to say that there's not going to be a machlokes.